Hey guys, Aussie Poker here. For this video, I'm going to be using the GTOWizard, but in a different way to what you might expect. What I'll be doing is I'll actually be talking through the hands as if I was playing it in a live poker tournament where I maybe don't know a mass amount about the players, but can draw some certain conclusions. So I'm going to sort of share how I would sort of play the hand, like from a exploitative point of view against the typical weaknesses of live players in Australia. And then so can compare it then with what the solver would do as such. So for a board like this, well, if we look at the pre-flop action, we basically have a free bet pot at this stage. And the board comes 9-3-3, so paired board. Honestly, a pretty safe board as undergun plus one's not really going to have any frees in their range here. So it means that our 9 is basically going to be good, like, unless they, decide to just call with an overpair, but I would say that most of the overpairs are going to be 4-betting as such in this instance. So, I mean, maybe 10s at call, maybe jacks call, but above that I think just will 4-bet in general. Especially live, like, these hands will often be 4-bet. So in a live setting, like, I think the solver would want me to bet 3.9 at this point. But in a live setting, I think I would actually bet 7.85. And the reason is that they're likely to be cold calling of a lot of hands that should be folding, like a lot of some ace-x flush draws. And so we're going to go kind of wanting to charge them a high price to continue, because they'll often will be over-defending with some different hands. So we're just going to charge like a high price for them to continue. It turns out they do fold. They folded like ace-queen there. But yeah, you can see that, the solver takes a different approach and wants to bet 3.9. And to be fair, in the live tournament, I have started to try for a little bit more of the solver approach as such, but just showing like if you're playing against someone who's going to be way over calling, like say if they're calling with the high cards, even if you bet half pot, you may as well bet half pot, but by betting this smaller amount, the logic is you do keep sort of the high cards in that you're sort of ahead of as such. Anyway, moving on to the next hand here. So looking at the pre-flop action, basically this is a single raised pot where we called a raise from the low jack, who is now checked to us. And this is a spot where I think in a live setting, it's just best to check most of the time. You could lead out some of the time if you think that your opponent is, basically continuation betting too often. Like if they continuation bet whenever they hit the flop or most of the time, it means that their checking range comes too weak, and you could exploit that by, making a bet of like even 2.2 or 3.7 to exploit that. But here I am going to check with the 2 overcards. The backdoor does give us some good equity here. And turns out we now just made top pair. And the general principle when playing against the recreational players is you want to try to get as many streets of value as you can from your good hands. Like if you've got top pair of a good pick here, like go for 3 streets of value unless the board is, really bad for top pair. Because a lot of times it's going to pay you off with worse, like a worse queen or with a 9. And in that case, like it makes it, I think, to go for a decent sizing, like 3.7 would be fairly standard. But I think here, with the good kicker, you can even go for 5.5. So that's what I'm going to do. Try to get called by a 9 or a queen. You do end up calling us. And when that ace comes, the thing to think about is you can also get, like, what ace-x hands would they have called that bet with, like, in a live setting, like, beyond the solver, but just in a live setting. Yeah, they would have called with ace-9. We kind of block ace-queen. Would they have called with ace-5? Probably not, but, they might have called with an ace-high flush draw. They probably would have done that. So it's an interesting spot. Like, when they check, though, you sort of, in a live setting, it would mean that they probably don't have the ace because they probably would let out on it. But because, there is a chance we probably would just go for thin value here. Just go for a small bet of 6.5, try and extract the maximum value. They end up folding. And it turns out they had pocket jacks in this instance, which did end up making the fold. Now, if we compare this thought process with, the solver approach, we see that actually here the exploitative approach is also the one that the solver wants to go for as well, where we think, say, okay, we're going to try to get a lot of value from the top pair, top kicker, because we're likely to get called by worse hands. These sort of underpairs are hands that we are targeting with this kind of bet. And at this point here, yeah, it's true that in general we should check here because the solver is going to check, the ace quite a bit on this sort of board, trying to incite some sort of bluff or, getting some weaker hand to bet. This sort of just protects the checking range, because if you bet every ace, then it would mean that when you check, the player can just shove, basically, can shove on you because you've clapped your range. But when playing against a human, you can, often try to get that extra street of value, because a lot of the time in a pub game, like let's say in the sort of live stakes Australia, a common weakness is that they'll just get married to their pocket pair and won't be able to let it go. So like you bet, they'll feel frustrated, but they're going to call and pay you off. So it's a way in which you can potentially get more money from like a sort of thin value bet here than what the solver play would be as such. You can see it is actually calling and shoving a decent chunk of the time. In a live setting, if they did shove here, you would probably just fold, because it means they probably have 2 pair or better, unless you have a specific read that your opponent is sort of over bluffing. And it's actually a very interesting thing I kind of realized, because I noticed that in the past I was probably a little bit too nitty of my fold, so I started to actually call shoves with good top pairs a lot more often. And I was actually surprised at how often people were just bluffing, like sort of on the flop, like as betting, shoving of like second pair, or shoving with a flush draw, or shoving with a straight draw. It was actually happening quite a lot. So it turns out that, because one thing I'd learned from some different coaches was like they always have it when they, go for the big bets, which I think is true in some things. Like in America, I think it tends to hold up. On Ignition, it seems to hold up a fair bit as well. But live, you'll see people do all kinds of bluffs that make no sense, meaning that they're okay, so you are going to want to call down a shove with your top pair. So this is one where, there will be some like recreational players who will just think, oh, I have top pair, top kicker, and just shove. And if you hit like 5s or 4s, you would just stack them. But this is basically a single raised pot where we are in the big blind. I don't think it really makes sense to have a leading range, like even exploitatively, like it just doesn't really make sense, because if you lead out when you have top pair, it makes your checking range way too weak, and alert players will pick up on it. So this is just going to be a check. If they bet, I think that in general you should check raise, because you are going to get paid off by a lot of worse hands at this point. In terms of the sizing, this I don't pretend to be like a big expert on the ideal check raise size, but I find that going like around pot or a little bit more than pot is what I normally go for, because even though like if you raise small, you're going to probably get called here. If you think in terms of how you play your whole range, if you're like betting small, you're almost always going to get called by these recreational players, but then it means that when you bet small, like with, let's say, just a draw, you're just basically building the pot when you're behind. Whereas by using some of the bigger sides, it allows you to, get folds from some pairs when you're bluffing, but also to get paid when you have value. So it kind of just works better both ways. Like the bigger size gets some better hands to fold when you're bluffing, and it gets some worse hands still to call when you aren't bluffing. And that's why I'm going to go with 5.35. Against a particularly maniacal player, like if I think that they're getting really tilted with the way I play, I might even consider shoving, thinking I might just call with some junk. But most of the time we are just going to play it a bit more straight up. Now, the king here is kind of an interesting one, because we don't have top pair anymore. We could still definitely go for some thin value here with ace 10, and I think that might be like the best play against a total calling station who, is going to continue with any sort of draw, like say a gut shot or whatever. We kind of block some of the draws, so I think it actually makes sense just to check call here. Another nice thing is that we kind of protect our checking range and kind of incite a bet where they might start to bet with some worse 10s, for example. So from an exploitative point of view, it's kind of nice to allow them to build the pot a little bit. This is one where, there's so little money in the pot that sometimes I just shove here, because I'm thinking, okay, they're still likely to call with worse, but at the same time, they're kind of unlikely to have a 4, and I think we're sort of likely to have a 4, so I'm going to just shove this one, because, I think the money's going in no matter what we do here, and we do end up getting the fold. So it turns out he had just ace high. And you can actually see it's kind of interesting how, because it's a little bit of a support experiment, like it's not caring about the ratings, but just playing it the way I would as if it was a live game. So it's kind of interesting to see that some of the things I'm saying from an exploitative point of view are actually quite logical from a solver point of view as well, actually. That, you can basically check out of position on the flop like almost every time, and if you do it every time, you're not really doing anything ridiculously wrong in general. Like it's very rare to have a donk leading range. You see also the exploitative raise size is actually the optimal one as well, according to the solver, which is kind of interesting. And sort of the one deviation we can see, which I think if you deviate once, it's not a big deal. I can see there's a very small difference in EV between options, but I kind of like going all in. It's just a way where you kind of, by having the option to bluff with value, it makes it much harder for him to put you on a hand if you like your shoves have all of value hands, bluffs, and the really big monster hands and such. Because then they can't just so easily call you with a bluff catcher then, where, in this case, yeah, ace 8 is meant to call all the time, but if you've got some small value hands in there, it's much harder to successfully call down with the bluff catchers as well that way, because you might beat a bluff catcher. So that's kind of an interesting point just from that hand. Let's play another hand with similar philosophy, just treating it like a live poker setting. So this one, we have a free bet pot where we did the free bet. Now 7-6-5 is kind of an interesting one because it's such a wet board where if we had called, this would hit our range so we could even consider a donk lead. In this case, so like we have the backdoor flush draw, we have 2 overcards, but the fact they called means I think that there are going to be a lot of 7s, 6s, and 5s in their range, whereas I think that we would be probably more likely to just call with those hands in a small blind and set mine against under the gun range. It was a bit tricky because, we started with only 17 big blinds or something, so that also means I was kind of short stacked to begin with, and I will admit some of the short stack play I do feel a little bit uncomfortable. A lot of times I will just be shoving or just folding and not really having a middle ground of just raising, except with, certain types of hands. So it's admittedly a spot where I don't pretend to be the most comfortable, but I think that in general I would just go for a check. It sounds very basic, of course, the big oversimplification, but I think that going for a check when you don't know what to do is kind of you can't sort of get yourself in too much trouble necessarily by going this approach. Yeah, it means sometimes you're going to miss out on some value, but I think that in general it makes sense. I think that this guy, if he had 7s, even some recreational players, they will sometimes check back some very strong hands. They will get over caught up in the idea of trapping because they saw in some high stakes game. But this one I think is just going to be a check here. But in this case, when we pick up the king, this is kind of an interesting spot because, the solver might check back in pocket 7s twice, but I do think there's a spot where when you're live and your hand improves like this, the recreational are almost always going to bet when they have a 4, when they have a set by now. So here you can just go for value. And then the question comes, do we go for a small bet or do we just go for an all-in and sort of turn the king almost into a kind of bluff, saying, okay, we had the 4s all along and we were just slow playing. But it seems like a very unlikely line to take. No, when you are this short, I guess, if you had the 4, logically you would probably release a little bit of money in the pot and then go for a bet that's more get called to extract more value. I think this is one where we just make it a 5, and if they shove, I think we just have to call because, they could just be bluffing some of the time. Now, in a live tournament, it's maybe a bit different. They're probably rarely bluffing if they shove there, but because it's very rare for people to river bluff, to raise the river as a bluff is just a very rare thing in live events. There's a that they did have king, queen, kind of a little bit of a cooler for us, I think, that one. Where, it just goes... So it says, we should actually bet that for a tiny amount. If you bet a tiny amount, you're just almost always getting called in live games, unless the board is very scary. Which, to be fair, the board is a little bit scary, but we're not really, betting 8-7, 8-9, for example. We're not free betting these kind of 9-8 suited hands, generally speaking. Even pocket 7s, I feel you might free bet some of the time. The way I play, I do sometimes free bet those pocket pairs, but from different positions. But I think that it's a spot where I can sort of understand the low bet size a little bit from the solver point of view. Just I said again, you should lead out a bit in this one due to having the range with a free bet. Because when you check twice, it definitely makes your range a bit weaker. And this one says you should just check at this point with the top pair. And to be fair, actually, there are some cases here where I do decide to check call against the recreational players. I just felt that the way that the hand played out, they could have some hand that checked maybe a weak pair where, they're afraid about different draws running out, and then, you can try it paid off on the river because you sort of underrepresent your hand. But this one they had the better hand. I think, it doesn't like the way we played it there. But anyway, we'll move on. To be fair, I think if we check, they would bet, and it probably ends up being a similar outcome anyway. But anyhow, this one here, we have another paired board as such. And yeah, we got the pocket aces with the spade blocker, which is quite nice. In a spot like this, like, it's just so cut and dry, like, either they, they have the 10 or they don't. I mean, they're going to have so much, a wide range in the big blind calling range that, yeah, I mean, they could have anything. Like, they could have a 4, they could have just complete air. So in this spot, when it's only 8 big blinds, I would probably lean towards a smaller size, just kind of build the pot up steadily, where you're kind of able to get value from, like, the sort of other pocket pairs that might be there, or from overcards, that sort of thing. Because not really worry about the flush draw and got the ace in hand, so I would probably just bet very small in general. He goes all in, and I think you just have to call here. Like, I mean, even on, like, in tournaments, like, I've noticed people, because the general thing is that people tend to way under bluff these paired board spots. But when you've got an overpair, like, they're going to be, doing this with, a lot of pairs, pocket pairs as well, in my experience. So it's just a call. If he has a 10, well, just unlucky. Turns out the guy here was, doing it with pocket fives, which is not that bad of a play. I think he just, happen to run into the aces. Not a lot you can do there. So it says, on the flop, we should actually bet 1.1. But like, if you bet 1.1, I think, it's one of these hands where, like, they're just going to continue with all the hands that they kind of, like, should, they're getting the right price for. And yeah, I mean, it's true, like, betting a little bit less is probably a bit smarter for, like, the reason of, like, just betting really tiny when you don't need protection. But yeah, I think it's not a big difference there, realistically, on a practical level. So for this one here, we're in the small blind. We've got the second pair. We don't really have a donk leading range, because if they were to raise big here, it would put us in a bit of a difficult spot, because we block some of the bluffs. So with the spade and with some gut shots, so we just check. We do pick up a gut shot, and I think this is actually a board where, in a time, like, when they check back, it means their range is probably going to be quite weak, especially with being a limp pot, where the ace does hit our range pretty well here. In fact, there are some cases where I would just lead with the ace there, just like saying, well, we more likely have an ace, because if they had an ace in a live game, there's a decent chance that they would raise it. So here, I think just going for the value here with 2 makes sense. And then I think this is a spot where actually I'm tempted to turn our hand into a bluff, actually, like bluffing with value. Yeah, we can check and we have decent showdown value and then try to bluff catch, but I feel like it's more effective to turn this into a bluff. Like, this is one thing I've started to do, like, somewhat recently in tournaments, like, to take my decent pair hands and just, like, we'll shove with them, or, make some big overbet, like 158% pot, on the basis that, like, they'll think, okay, this guy's betting so big that it's quite likely to be a bluff, especially if they've seen me use similar sizes with bluffs earlier in the tournament. It's a way you can kind of get them to level themselves, like, okay, he bluffed it before, he could be again, so I have to call. And then they might just call down, like, with something ridiculous, like, King 7 or something at this point. So this one, we have, like, such good blockers, I think we can actually shove here. And let's see if he calls it or not. He does end up folding. So he had 9-6. So yeah, it says it's not the right move here, that you should just fold. But let's look at, like, what the exact percentages are. So it says that you should lead out some of the time, because the ace does hit your range better. So it's something I kind of only realized after I made my decision. It's a good reminder for me as well, that the high cards favor small blinds limping over the big blinds checking range. So we have a check. We bet 2. And yeah, wants to bet a bit more. I actually wants to go for the overbet in this case, I think, because we have the gut shot draw and we have the flush draw blocker. So it's kind of turning the hand into a sort of a bluffing with value kind of category, in a sense. So, I mean, not really getting an ace to fold, but, you're sort of, kind of just able to setting up for a really nice shove on the river. So that when you do get to this stage, like, if you would bet 4, then yeah, it becomes, like, a lot more feasible then to shove if you've got, like, let's say 11 big blinds in the pot. Is that right? Yeah, if you have 11 big blinds in the pot and you have 12 behind it, yeah, this shove kind of is a lot more likely to be successful. Yeah, the difference in EV is not massive. Like, I think that in general, players, like, in tournaments, like, they do tend to overfold to shoves in general, in my experience. It can be a exploit, like, to, slightly over bluff is something that, Michael Adamo likes to do quite successfully in the really high level events. But if you also have some, like, value hands in the range, it's also an interesting spot. I suppose one argument maybe against shoving here is that you're probably not going to get called by worse hands. You're probably not going to get called by, like, 10-9 or so that. Like, you're really trying to get an ace to fold in that spot. And, there will be some players who will fold an ace, and there'll be some who are just never going to fold top pair ever. So you have to, also keep an eye on, like, what hands your opponents are showing down, like especially when someone does a big value bet, like if they are calling down like with top pair all the time, and then you don't probably do it for this play, and would just go for the smaller bet. But yeah, for this one, it is just folding. It says it calls to pay 3% of the time, and then you would get value because they are blocking the. I guess the fact they're blocking the straight actually probably does make it more likely you fold into that sort of spot. But anyway, that was that hand kind of an interesting one there. Let's do a few more like this. There's actually sort of a river point I really want to try to explain, but I'm not sure if we're going to get that situation come up or not. Basically, it's a situation where you kind of can't like win it at the showdown. Then that's often a place where the GTOWizard solver is often going to be going for some like big bluffs at that stage. And I actually started doing that a little bit in tournaments as well, where I previously would just check and just give up when I missed the board completely, and still made it to river. Because, it would sort of be like, okay, let's just lose the minimum here. But then I realized that people actually do tend to fold quite a bit to river aggression, and I started to, incorporate some, like, somewhat decent bet sizes with bluffs on the river a bit more. And I was actually surprised how many people would fold, and I would just be able to steal the pot with a hand that just, like, had no chance of winning at showdown. But anyway, this one here, we do have the second pair top kicker. We are in position. We do have been the one to free bet. And I think the fact that we free bet does lean this more towards being a bet. It's just a question of sizing. And one thing that I sort of have picked up from the solve I've started to incorporate in the live play is something I kind of call stringing them along. Where if like the stacks are not so deep, like rather than just shoving it in and just, getting them out of there, which, I do on occasion just to kind of keep them guessing and to try to sort of tilt them into making some bad calls where they just get sick of being shoved on and just mentally snap. Which I do know happens quite a lot in the live games, but against players who may be not so emotional, who are still trying to think somewhat rationally, while doing these spots often I will just kind of string them along with these kind of small bets to sort of keep them in. Like if a scare card comes, just sort of to check it back, but then just sort of continue like just extracting that small amount from them. Like if we like shove, I think that we do get called by like different hands. Like in live, you would often get called by a flush draw, or a gut, or like a open-ended draw at this point, like a Jack 9, let's say. Okay, not that Jack 9 should be in the hand, but like, you are going to see a lot of these guys like just, raise, like call with like half the deck to your like free bet or to your raise. It's just beautiful. So this one I am going to shove here again, trying to get the value from weaker 10s. Turns out, he had 9-8, so actually we, he sort of used a bluff catcher, and it's true that the solver says this was a completely wrong play. But I think that, these are kind of exploits that, if your opponents, are not playing correctly, you can often just get so much value just by going 2 streets with your good hands here. Whereas if you check, okay, it doesn't apply as much when you're short stacked, you're still going to be able to get the money in and protect your sort of checking and betting range that way by putting some good hands in there. But if your opponent's like not making any exploitative adjustments at all and just like playing their game, then it's a place where you can just try to just extract lots of value from them and, just get the money in good and not, overcomplicate it. Because like if let's say a jack comes on the river, or if spade comes on the river, then you're suddenly put in a bit of a tough spot. Whereas here, you can just sort of like get the money in when you're good. And they have EV as like a lot less than checking if you're playing against a good player, but if they're playing with all kinds of garbage in their range, then you can sort of make these adjustments to kind of be a bit more aggressive than usual because you have a bigger range and not advantage in the opponent than what the solver's defensive range gives. It's something good to kind of realize with the solver outputs that they're only plus up they're based on the opponent playing with a perfect range that in most live games they're not going to be defending with that range properly. They're going to be usually having a much wider calling range as such. There'll be some maniacs with a wider racing range, but most of the time, they're going to be just like kind of loose passive, and this is sort of, just talking a little about some adjustments you might make that, are different to what the solver will tell you to do, let's say. This one I think we should just check every single time we only called their raise. And it's the problem with cold calling, like if they bet there, you probably have to fold in a live setting. You just don't really have anything, and having this board run out is, I think it's actually not a very good board run out for us. I think that Undergun will be raising with a lot of suited aces there, like sort of as the bluffs, which now I've got there with the the ace of spades. So this one I think is just a fold. Like you've got the gut shot, but it just doesn't really make sense to turn into a bluff, like just in general when there's a flush draw on the board. where you could just be owning yourself. So we just fold here, and yeah, it kind of played itself. He had ace jack, so again, that's sort of the point I made that the bluffs they have are still going to be ahead of our hands. And also, actually, with queen jack, honestly, I would probably fold in that spot pre-flop. Just because I think against the undergun range specifically, you're just so likely to be dominated by a hand like ace jack here, or ace queen, even like king queen suited. You're just in such terrible shape against so many of these hands. And, you know, there's a lot more combinations of those kind of hands than there are of like the lower pocket pairs, like the 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s and such. So I would actually fold that pre-flop and probably save myself a bit of money in retrospect. Because often like the plays like with what you call with are going to be based on being able to defend very well post-flop out of position, which is quite a difficult thing to do. And so that's why it's like not sometimes better just to cut your losses and to put yourself in a really tough spot where you might lose a lot more money as you're kind of improving and, you know, still trying to learn some more advanced concepts of the game. This one I actually have started to play a little bit more like the solver. Like this is actually a spot I've kind of been meaning to sort of work on and to try to like get some advice from others from. Because I notice on monotone boards, like the way that they play out in live is like 100% different to the way the solver plays out. Like for example, if this was live and I was in the hijack position, the live play would likely bet a pretty large amount. Like they would bet, it's usually somewhere between like 5 and 8.5 big blinds. Like they're afraid of like the flush draw getting there. It's like, okay, let's try to get the top pairing while it's good. But yeah, it's not really, I think, the optimal way to play it. So in these spots, I normally do just try to play a bit like the solver. I don't really know how to play when they deviate, but at least I know I have a good starting point. So this one we are going to make it one big blind, actually. On the basis that, you know, they often will still fold the garbage hands. But they also might call with some, like, overcards as well. I think this one is just a check. Because, yeah, I think a lot of their continuing hands are going to have, like, high cards. And when it's two-pair, this is a spot where the solver will turn the two-pair into a bluff, like, kind of representing the flush in some cases. But yeah, I think that because if we had like a baby flush here, we might check the turn and get it on the river. But I think that there's a nice way to play it just with your range in general. Turns out they have pocket sixes, so yeah, we end up actually getting all the money in really good here. But yeah, on the flop, you can see it actually is checking when you don't have the flush, which is kind of interesting. But I find it, yeah, just betting small with all your range. Like I find that, well, not all your range, but like with the hands that have some sort of value. That's what I normally do just as a way to kind of have something that's easy to kind of follow in a game setting. And yeah, you lose a little bit of EV by doing it, but it's, yeah, the board doesn't come up that often. And it's like just not that costly, I think, to play it this way. And yeah, this one we do indeed go ahead and shove at this point. Like I've sort of known from working with the solvers that you're normally turning the two pairs into sort of your bluffs as such in the on the monotone boards. And yeah, we do get the value, so that's always nice. We're gonna play two more hands here before finishing this video because they'd promised that I wouldn't be doing like, you know, study to support event, and here I'm like still doing study, but saying all this for YouTube so I can get away with it. Yeah, if you do enjoy this video, do make sure to like and also consider subscribing. So this one, yeah, we have 3-3-2 is a very interesting board because the first instinct you think is that it favors the small blinds range because, you know, they might be calling with like ace-3, ace-2, hands that we would likely fold pre-flop, you know, unless we are, you know, raising the suit. Ace is kind of an exploit, thinking our opponents are going to pay us off their whole stack when we hit our flush or hit a straight. But yeah, I think that in this spot, it actually does make sense to lead out for a small amount just because their calling range is going to have all kinds of junk that you can often just get them to fold just by betting a little bit. And saying, okay, like I've got a pocket pair, like an overpair, you have nothing, just fold your overcards. And a lot of time, though, they will just fold the overcards. When they shove here, I think it's just an easy fold, though. And it's also one thing, like, as well, like when you're playing live, like if they do have a good hand, they're normally just going to shove it. And so you can just kind of get away quite easily and, you know, sort of avoid situation like where you might maybe have a much more difficult fold if it's like check, 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 and then they shove on the river. It's a lot tougher than if they just, you know, shove on you earlier. Well, actually, maybe that's not entirely true for live because the general philosophy is they're a lot more likely to be bluffing on when they shove, like on, or when they raise big on the flop. It's rare they're going to be doing it on the turn, and it's like almost never they do it on the river if you take like the American players. The Australians are a little bit more maniacal, a bit more gambly, but yeah, we can see we got away from a combo draw. Whereas if we check there, yeah, we could be in a very tough spot with a bluff catcher. But there we can just sort of get away easily, like just by, doing a bet that only has to work like 25% of the time, where they have to defend 75% of the time to, to avoid just exploiting them and having the bet be instantly profitable. And in practice, very really are going to defend with 75% hands on that board. Anyway, this one we have 2 overcards. We only got called. I think it's a pretty standard C-bet because nice about C-betting here, and I think with normally these C-bets, what I find is that if you want overcards to call you, then betting like a third pot will normally get that. I find in live that is called all the draws, a lot of the overcards. But if you sort of don't want the overcards to call you, then I find using like the half bet size is quite nice. Now, when we have the overcard itself, it's kind of interesting. Like I sort of have noticed that like it's sort of a psychological thing. Like I sort of experimented a bit in some live events with like just betting a third pot with a wider part of my range so that I could basically do it with some value hands, but also be able to put more bluffs in my range as well to try and take the pot down early. But I noticed that when I did that, I seemed to be getting called quite a lot when I put this bet size in. So I think for this one, since we don't really want to be called ideally, I think that actually this bet size is a bit more sensible from an exploitative point of view. Now, when the board pairs, I find that normally favors the... Like, if there was a big blind, it would favor the big blind's range by quite a bit. But here's an interesting question, because, like, we do have, ace-10. We have, okay, king-10 suited is maybe going a little bit too far. So since we only have, like, ace-10 really as a combination of benefits from this, I think that this is actually going to be a check. Where when the board pairs, like, people are also a lot less likely to bluff. So if they check, it means you're probably, if you have a pair, you're decent chance you're good. And if they bet, you're probably just beat. So here we do have top pair, so I do think it actually makes sense to just go for it. Because, well, I mean, I think we can get called by a lot worse jacks, even by a 7 or even a 5 live if they're quite weak. So I think that we just shove here, and if they have the 10, they have the 10, But in the end, yeah, you had king, queen, so turns out, yeah, we got lucky hitting the jack, and that, yeah, by... Well, I mean, it's true, like, if we bet 2.15 in live, that hand would call. If we bet over half pot, often the overcards are just going to fold, and it would be a nice little exploit where, yeah, you can see that, of course, the solver's going into completely different. It does want to go the 1/3 pot route, but live just going to get called by pretty much any cards like king, queen, or better for the overcards to kind of just value owning yourself a little bit if you do that, whereas live you will get those cards to fold a lot by betting a bit over half pot. And then if we look at the rest of the hand, yeah, kind of played, I think, pretty normally. Just check, check. Yeah, the all-in is, yeah, a little bit of a case where, yeah, it's probably a bad idea and that, the solver is, not going to defend with, worse hands than a jack. So this is a spot where it's probably better to check call and kind of allow them to bluff at it. But, yeah, in the end, they fold and, yeah, it just is what it is. So one more hand up and then we'll finish after that. So for this one, we have yet another paired board. I'm interesting we've got a few of them come up in this session. And here, yeah, we limped in the small blind. They raised and we defended as such. Actually, it's what I've noticed with live games in general, that when you're a more aggressive player and you limp, I notice that people will tend to raise over you a lot more than they otherwise would. Is kind of a tendency that I've kind of observed, because they just think, okay, if you're betting all your good hands, just limping complete garbage. But yeah, it can be a case where like limping some good hands to small blind can be a nice exploit if you know that they're kind of going to just be raising you like most of the time when you limp. Okay, maybe I probably have a selective memory, like you sort of forget the times they check, you remember the times they raised you. But I've noticed it to be a bit of a live thing where they will often raise in the big blind if you do show some weakness, let's say. To be honest, probably half the people who are doing it probably picked up from me doing the same thing where it'd be like 5 limpers and I'd make it like 10x in the big blind, make it 2x pot. They honestly probably learned it from me and now starting to do it back at me, ironically. But yeah, this board, I think it just smashes. Well, if they had just checked, it would absolutely smash the big blind's range. When they raise, though, it's kind of an interesting spot because, yeah, it sort of doesn't really hit either player's range. So since we're out of position, I think that just a check here is fine. I mean, I guess he could be raised with pocket twos, that doesn't play maybe so well post-flop, like very specific hand. Yeah, when the 8 comes, I think this is one where we just check it down, honestly. Like, that's the way I would play it. In the live setting, like, if they check again, maybe I lead out on the river. But when they bet, especially a big size, we just get out of there. Really not a question. So kind of, yeah, an easiest shorter hand to finish up with. And, yeah, they had the bluff with Jack-9 suited. But I find that, like, if you are playing people, like, what they're going to do with this hand normally is they're just going to check again, and then, if you check the river, they're probably going to lead out, and yeah, it sort of That's the way they normally play it. Or sometimes they will just like check down, like if they're really loose passive, which a lot of like the older players often are. But anyway, that was sort of my, using GTOWizard, like just using it as the examples more so than the hand analysis, but just to kind of share what some of my thoughts are like on some different exploits you can make, like what sort of the main weaknesses of the sort of live players and how you can try to exploit them accordingly. Of course, yeah, if you're in a different country in Australia or even a different region, they might play a very different way there, of course. I think it's something very important to understand with poker. You can't really just put it down to a simple formula of, oh, I just do this all the time and play this way no matter what, and I'm just going to win. That, you do have to be paying close attention to what that specific player is doing wrong. Of course, what they're doing right as well, but especially like what mistakes they're making so that we can then make the exploitative adjustments. I do find that the sort of patterns I mentioned here do, in my experience, hold true a lot for a lot of like the weaker players. And, this is not just coming purely from my own experience. Like I have, watched a lot of training videos where they sort of, people would mention these sort of patterns and I would see if they held up in the live games. And, a lot of the time they did, but there were sometimes also a few subtle differences with the Australian players I've tried to like mention here. Like probably the biggest ones, I think the Australian players do tend to be a little bit more gambly, like sort of a little bit more bluffy, where they might sort of greatly overvalue like the pocket pairs, overvalue sort of some weak pairs compared to some others. That's the case where, going more for value if some of our bet size can really be very powerful. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Yeah, feel free to check out some more as well. Should be a suggested one just after this. So yeah, I'll see you in the next one.